what's interesting to me is that I feel like historically we've seen the good churches and the bad churches historically, right? And typically it was the bad churches, they had the bad theology, and then they were also running the corporate structure, and it was just a money-making scheme. Typically it would be the people that you'd see on TBN. It would be like the Benny Hinn's, the Joel Osteens, that sort of thing, right?
Robert Schuller.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Rick Warren, whatever it is. Now I feel like we're seeing the bad church practices combined with good theology, and it's that blending of truth and error. And because they have the good theology, all of a sudden now everybody comes to their defense for doing the exact same things that all the TBN guys did in the past. And it's crazy to me how people don't see through it. And I think a lot of it is this celebrity worship and all these
cult of personality. The cult of personality.
For sure, totally. So why do you think that there's been this change so rapidly, so quickly, where even, like I've been saying, I feel like every single podcast, the good guys, we're seeing compromise left and right. Why do you think that's happened in such a quick space of time?
Partly because of God's judgment, I think. I think this is God's giving us over, and judgment begins in the house of the Lord. And I think some of this is God's judgment. I think some of it's also the internet. With the internet and the ability to watch what these guys are saying and doing, and then some of them, you watch how they behave on social media. That reveals a lot. But when you're recording and everything is going out there, and you can go find it and research it and then check things out. For instance, today, someone sent us, or yesterday, an audio of Alistair Begg declaring that, Joseph in the book of Genesis storing up for the year of famine during the year of plenty is an example of the welfare state. And so here is Alistair Begg trying to use that text to say this is a good example of the welfare state. You can't expect people in the year of plenty to put away for hard times. You can't expect the majority of people are going to do that. And therefore, since the purpose of the state is the welfare of the people, this is a good example of the welfare state. And so what did he do? He stored up and then he gave it away. Well, then Alistair Begg turns around and contradicts the idea of a welfare state and says, but if the people thought that he was going to open up the storehouse and give it to them, they were wrong. He was going to sell it to them. Mm-hmm. Well, hello, Alistair. Guess what then? It wasn't a welfare state, was it?
Right.
Just because he taxed the people and took a percentage of grain and then turned around and sold it to them certainly doesn't make it a welfare state if he's selling it to them. But that's not what's going on in Genesis, an example of a welfare state. Plus, I would think Alistair at this point in his career ought to know what is described is not necessarily what is prescribed. Mm-hmm. So what is being described is not necessarily what is being prescribed. And if it is, then maybe Alistair ought to join the Word of Faith, because how is it that Joseph knew there was going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine? God revealed this to him in a vision or in a dream, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're going to take that this is an example of welfare state policies coming from the Bible, then maybe we should also jump into the idea of visions and dreams. Is Alistair willing to go to that? I mean, does Alistair want to join the whole Word of Faith NAR type movement? Probably not. So how can he get away with this sloppy treatise of the Scriptures? So this is an example. And again, would we have expected this from a guy like Alistair Begg? No, not really. I mean, but he is part of the Gospel Coalition, so I'm not really shocked. But at one degree, I still am shocked. So if it wasn't for the internet, would we know these things? So I think some of these guys have been saying silly things for a long time. Just nobody knew about it unless you attended that church. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that silliness would be edited out of their radio shows. That's another thing. Many of these guys on traditional terrestrial radio, they sound really good on terrestrial radio because their 45-minute sermons are taken and chopped down to 24 minutes or 22 minutes by the time you do the open and close and the appeal for donations, which is fine. So you got 22 minutes of a sermon and they pulled out the best of the best. Any off-the-cuff remarks are cut out. So you listen to a guy on terrestrial radio with a Bible teaching program, you're like, he's rock solid. Well, all the garbage was just cut out. Mm-hmm. On the internet, you're getting the full thing. So I think part of it's always been there. I also think some of these guys have always been liberal. Now they're just willing to be more comfortable with it as it becomes more and more mainstream. It's now safe to say the things they've always believed. They just guarded what they would say. Yeah. And as the trends change, many of these guys are pragmatists. It's funny because a lot of them preach against pragmatism, but I think some of them are the king of pragmatism. And now as the trends are changing and young people are becoming more liberal within so-called evangelicalism, they're becoming a little more progressive themselves and hanging out with social justice warriors and the people teaching goofy things and part of the Gospel Coalition and teaching white privilege and pushing for amnesty and pushing IFD. And yet they're hanging out with them. And you're like, why on earth are you doing this? All I can assume is either they always were a little liberal, they just had to be careful not to be a part of that so they didn't offend their base, who gives them the money, the older people. And or if their base is now dying off and they need to appeal to a new base, they now are going to go ahead and appeal to this more liberal generation to harvest new donors. So I think there's a lot of pragmatism and a lot of reasons why we're now seeing what we're seeing.
Right, for sure. And it's really interesting because I feel like all of the guys that I feel like I used to look up to, and that I feel like the majority of solid Christians used to look up to, whether it was Al Mohler or John Piper. I mean, you've got Al Mohler that's now saying that homosexuality isn't a choice and that he's repented of that. You've got John Piper. Oh, I know it's going to be in there. I mean, you've got John Piper that's anti-Second Amendment. You've got all these guys that are compromising left and right. And like you were saying, it's like, have they always been this leftist, or is this a new thing and they're just appealing to the new younger crowd? And it's just